Scary and disturbing park ranger stories. Story 1. Dead and Rotting. I was patrolling the David Compton Trail in Glacier National Park late one night. We had got a call about a mysterious disappearance and a few other things. On a whim, I decided it would be a good time to test out my new recording equipment as I walk through the woods. It didn't take long for me to realize just how nuts I was to be the one to volunteer to go out here all alone in search of this mysterious missing person. It was late at night, of course, and the surrounding brushes seemed wrong. They weren't rustling with life. There was this eerie presence all around me. You know, even though it's my job, I briefly considered turning back, but continued with the hopes that the further I got in, the closer I would make it to this missing person. The wind was now starting to pick up, and occasionally getting bits of rain. The weather turned more and more horrid the further I went, and now I was a few miles into a completely open area. No shelter, nothing. The missing person was only supposed to be about a half mile off the trail at most. Now, I had gone too far. I wasn't really sure what to do, and a storm was coming in. I decided to try and sit down and wait out the storm under a large tree. That's when I began hearing strange noises. Noises I could not quite discern or pinpoint what they were coming from or where they were coming from. These weren't like your typical animal noises. They were strange howls and weird clicks. Maybe I'm stupid, but I could have swore I heard whispers. It sounded like some row of animals hushing each other. My first reaction was to turn up my earpiece to try and get a better interpretation of the noise. I did, and almost wish I didn't. I got up, packed up my equipment, and even in the storm, I just told myself, this isn't worth it. I'm going to try to make it back to the station. About 4 or 5 minutes walking back in the weather, my battery starts to beep. Great, I thought. So I kept going, and the rain just kept getting worse. And I, of course, didn't bring the right equipment, so I'm getting pelted, hit with cold wind and wet. And then, even amongst all of that, I hear that strange whispering again and again. But it doesn't sound like it's coming from a person, but more like it's coming from some animal. I can't really describe it. I know it sounds strange. It's hard for me to paint a picture of what I saw, because honestly, it was disgusting. Whatever was making these noises finally decided to reveal itself. Whatever started off as a whimper now came to a full-on cry, as this nasty thing crawled out of the bushes in front of me and began coming towards me. It looked like what I could describe as a decrepit, oversized, deathly raccoon. Maggots and rotting flesh falling off of it. Tiny holes with blood. It was disgusting. I was terrified, and I had no idea what it was I was dealing with. Like I stated, imagine a raccoon maybe triple the size, walking upright, flesh rotting off, maggots falling out of its body, and dull white eyes. This thing was walking towards me, this giant, misshapen, fly-infested body. I could tell it wanted to kill me, or do something bad. While thinking quickly, and acting even quicker, I detach my hatchet, and I swing it, landing right between its eyes and its skull, square in the head. The blade burrows itself deep into this thing's skull, and it drops to the ground. I don't even reach back for my hatchet. I just take off running right there, not risking anything. I take off running in the storm, trying to get back to my cruiser. The last thing I remember before falling unconscious is those same screams in the distance that I'd heard, except there was more of them. The strange flash of light, that did not appear to be of this world came right by me and completely consumed me. The next thing I know, I've woken up on the forest floor. It's daylight morning, and I'm getting questioned by all the other rangers. Where have I been? What happened to me? Why did I not report back to the station? They found the missing person. Turns out they were closer to the road than half a mile. But I was missing. I knew I couldn't really tell them about what I saw, so I played it off. Say I tripped on a rock and hit my head, lost consciousness. I don't think they believed it for long, but what else was I supposed to say? This was a very disturbing experience, and I'm not even sure what it is I saw that night. Sometimes I think back to it and wonder if I just hallucinated it, or maybe it was some sort of lucid nightmare. But I don't know. What I saw was more real than you and I sitting here, talking. More real than me typing this up. But one thing for sure is, out of all the things I've seen on this job, that takes the cake. And this animal, this creature, there was something very, very wrong with it. Story 2. Men in Black. Okay, this is my own harrowing tale. Back when I was just a rookie ranger. This was a few years into my service, and even though I'd already been in the service for a few years, I was still very much a rookie in my overall experience. One day, I spotted an unmarked pickup in a remote Forest Service road, right near the Lewis and Clark National Forest here in eastern Montana. Immediately, I called dispatch to get a ranger there as soon as possible. It looked to be a crime scene, or something had happened. The truck was pretty badly banged up, with much of the windows shattered, massive dents all along the hood, the side of the back, taillights smashed out, one of the back tires completely popped, not like it ran over a rock, but as if it was torn off the rim, and what appeared to be blood all over the side of the pickup and partly on the ground, looking like there was at least foul play going on. I was told by my superiors to call the county sheriff and report it, remaining on scene until other law enforcement officials could show up at the scene and assist. The sheriff questioned me, and I told him what I had discovered. He assured me that this situation would be contained and would ultimately turn out to be a misunderstanding. I questioned him. What did he mean by misunderstanding? He just followed up by indirectly saying he was grateful I called it in, saving his department the trouble of having to track down this nasty situation, applying that this kind of misunderstanding happened often. I had no idea what he was talking about. It wasn't making any sense. Finally, an unmarked van showed up. 3 men get out, who we were told that they were a part of the Department of Homeland Security. They were in all black, and told us both immediately that we no longer had jurisdiction, and we were forced to leave right then and now. Their demeanors went from stern and professional to almost instantaneously callous and brutal, trying to convince me, my boss, and the sheriff to drop the entire thing, to tell us we were not to talk about anything that we had seen, we were not allowed to ask any questions, nor were we allowed to contact any other officials, whether it be my boss's superiors, regional agents, or other members of the Department of Homeland Security. One of these agents pulled the sheriff aside, and they spoke for about 5 or 6 minutes before returning back. The sheriff very kindly just put his hand on my shoulder and told me, "Listen up. You don't want to mess with these guys. Let's just call it off and leave." Very weird things hearing from a sheriff, but the story gets a little more weird. The more I kept looking at these agents wearing all black, they didn't look right. I mean that in a different way. Their skin tone was off. They kind of looked more polished, if that makes any sense. Like their flesh had too much glow to it. and they were kind of very mono-expressive and monotone, almost moving erratically. I know this thought is crazy and bizarre, and just make sure you take it with a grain of salt. A thought flickered in my mind for a moment. Are these men, or are these androids? Because they're certainly acting like it. Their movements were more akin to arigato, Mr. Roboto, the dance, rather than a natural, smooth-flowing human movement. Just an observation, of course. Not that I actually believe that. And being in my rookie park ranger position, there was not much I could say, not much I could do, other than conform to the decision of my officials and my superiors. Following my commands, I left, as did the sheriff. Sometimes I often think back to that case, and ultimately, what attacked that truck? What happened? And why were these men in black so quick to jump on the case? They were there pretty quickly after we made phone calls, which is very unusual given the area we were in, and the length and the distance we were from anything nearby. Usually, out there, it takes a couple of hours before somebody can get out to us, even in a situation like that. But in this case, I felt like there was just something more there. Story 3. The Crazy Ranger. It was around 5 p.m. one evening, when I went out, as usual, to do my rounds and survey the part of the park. I was assigned to the north side, which is kind of out of the way of the rest of the rangers' patrols. I was on foot, and it took me roughly an hour to completely walk around the entirety of the perimeter. This is roughly a several-mile trip. Once getting back to the station, I sat down, pulled out my radio. I was on my way into the office when I saw the ranger station at the west entrance. There was a ranger running towards me. He looked terrified and hyperventilating. I didn't recognize this ranger. In fact, I didn't recognize him at all. Our team is very small and we don't hire often. For a second, I had to look at him and realize, did he just transfer here and nobody told me? We kind of lock eyes for a second, and I listen as he lost his breath trying to form words. He just handed me this piece of paper, pointing and shaking his finger at me. I know what you did. Then bolts towards the guard station and disappears. What just happened? I took the piece of paper. It was just a blank index card. I opened it. Baffled by what had just happened, I unfold the piece of paper. What's written on it says the same thing, with the words, "I know what you did." Then underneath it, the words, "I buried her here." And then what looked to be a set of coordinates. Not only was this disturbing, but it was incredibly puzzling. Who was this mysterious ranger, or impersonator of a ranger, I would say? I was so perplexed, I immediately called my manager and asked him, "Hey, did we bring anybody else on the team? Any interns, anybody transferred that I know about?" He seemed puzzled and told me no. I kindly explained the situation of what had just happened, and that I think there might be somebody buried at these specific coordinates that was given to me on this note. My boss, like any good boss, seemed extremely distraught and concerned at the fact that there were the sayings, "I buried her here," and gave physical coordinates. When punched in, the coordinates landed exactly 3.7 miles away from the ranger station, just northeast. Wanting to take this as seriously as possible, we called in the appropriate team. The next thing you know, people are at that exact coordinate location, digging. Sure enough, there was a large, freshly dug industrial-sized garbage bag, full of bones, human bones. Not just random bones, but almost an entire skeleton, minus a couple limbs, several ribs, and some vertebrae, all very freshly decomposed. It appeared as if this skeleton was dug out of the ground, placed in this bag, and then buried at this spot. My team and I and everybody else was on the lookout for this mysterious impersonator of a ranger. I have no idea who this man was, what his purpose was, and why he was so out of his mind, and what he meant by, "I know what you did." Why was he out of breath? What was he talking about? And why did he hand me a piece of paper that said that, along with the coordinates? After speaking this over with my boss, we came to the conclusion that this impersonator must have just been some crazy homeless person, probably twacked on drugs, and was just fried. It's very possible that the same person murdered and buried this body. Although we were never able to find him or come to any conclusive evidence that he had anything to do with it. I later learned that the body would belong to a 22-year-old female, Emma Rife, who had been a longtime resident of the area and was hiking and last seen around this national park, but had gone missing a long time ago. Almost 2 years now. Crazy park ranger impersonator. Let's not meet again. Story 4. The Murderer. Years back, I worked as a ranger in a fairly known and large national forest. At the time, I had a trail crew working in a very remote part of the forest. So remote, I may have been the only person to hike in there for the entirety of the year, other than the crew. It was a group of 5 of us, and they were hiking out after a week of construction and repairs on the trail. Apparently, they came upon a man sitting on a log, waiting in the middle of the trail, completely intimidating them. At first, they thought they had found somebody who was lost, but this was not the case. They were met with hostility. The encounter turned from a near random meeting to a situation they were not prepared for. This man, which they found sitting in the middle of the path, wearing what looked to be a robe, at 6'4". Under the robe, he wore combat boots, army pants, the jungle kind made back in the 90s, completely unshaven, long hair and a massive beard, and had a military-issued M9 bayonet. He had dried blood all over his clothes, and what they described as a crazy look on his face. On his waist side, he kept a large machete, also with blood splatters on it. Before I go any further, I just want to connect the dots for you. Up until this point, the entirety of this crew working on this trail and repairing, they were finding dead animals all over this trail that they had to walk down into. I'm talking everything from birds, foxes, deer, just dead animals lying by, in, and around the trail. All of them decapitated by something. Not torn off or anything, but chopped off. Somebody was walking around out here, chopping the heads off of random animals. I sometimes wonder how this person, realizing it was now him, how he would be able to even get close enough to an animal like a fox or a deer to do this. But either way, this is what my crew reported. And long after this, there would eventually be several different campsites of human bones all scattered throughout this area, meaning that this man must have went through and killed several homeless camps worth of people. I'm not talking about hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe 8 or 9 people at most, since there were multiple different homeless camps, or establishments, I should say, with a tent or two, that he had gone through and decapitated them, since their remains were later found. Apparently, there was also a mutilated arm found, barely more than a stump, nearby, and almost a full human skeleton. But since this was so tucked into the woods, it was assumed that he must have lived or came apart with another compound in the area, or a group of people in which he later went rogue and killed them all. That's the only assumption how we can describe how there'd be at least that many people out here, in the middle of nowhere, in a national forest, without ever being discovered. Okay, now back to the part of the story where this man started to intimidate these workers, pulling out his M9 bayonet, threatening them, making all sorts of gibberish, not making much sense. They were fortunate enough to be able to calm him down to a rational mentality and escape the area without harm. They alerted the proper authorities, and when police went back there to investigate, I guess he was naked, completely, and chased after them with a machete. He was tased, taken down, and detained. They said that when they questioned him, he acted as if he could not speak. I think he was out of his mind. And upon that investigation, they would later find all the bones, followed by more decapitated animals. I know this probably isn't on par with your usual scary stories of things like dogman and bigfoot, but I hope it serves as a warning to you to be very cautious when venturing out into the woods by yourself, or even with friends or family. You never know who or what is out there lurking. You just never know. Story 5. Watching You. It was mid-July, 2003. I was busy working as a seasonal ranger at Lake Meredith near Amarillo, Texas. My regular partner at the time was a person whom we'll call Kim, a fellow seasonal ranger, as well as a former Marine. He shall be known here as Kay. This day, our hands were full, due to the temperatures and overall conditions we were forced to deal with. We were busy in all directions, and only had the occasional moment to pause and reflect back upon the territory we then patrolled. It often seemed like a great deal of time was spent just keeping up with our assignments. Perhaps it's a function of the job and that sort of people that choose the work at Lake Meredith. At this point, it was about 4 in the afternoon, July 11th, 2003, when things took a slightly more technical turn in more ways than one. It was during one of these down moments when we were checking on the hydrology of the upper lake, measuring water flow and temperatures. While I was involved in reports, Kay was seated on the ground at the water's edge, painstakingly siphoning the water with some strange contraption made up of tubing in a small, open plastic bag. A vertical tube had been placed in the water at a distance of around 8 feet from ground level. On the end of the tube was one of those rocket engines, the ones you'd use for a toy boat. On a rock nearby was a pile of them. A short distance away, yet still within immediate hearing distance, was our pickup. We'd switched off the motor. About 3 gallons of water had been siphoned down into the bag as I was about to speak and say something to Kay. His demeanor was different. He seemed frozen, listening for a moment. I just stared blankly when, suddenly, he jumps up, snatching his pistol. He hopped, as if a sudden cramp had seized him. Perhaps the dehydration was getting to him. Rather than losing any more time, we collected our gear, quickly, and headed back down toward the Suburban. As we reached the truck, it was apparent that Kay was unhappy about something. Disturbed, but acting kind of quiet. Even uncharacteristically untalkative. Finally, I asked him if he was all right. He told me that he had heard some sort of noise behind us, but that he did not get a visual. I was about to continue the follow-up inquiry when he again shocked me. He barked me to stop and remain quiet. For a moment, I figured that this was just another one of those weird states, oddly diluted in the heat, that the heat could bring on. Then, he slowly began backing away from me, his eyes wide, scanning somewhere behind my right shoulder. Now, I was starting to get scared too. Kay almost began to hum, as if he was intently listening for something. Anything that might venture within earshot. After about 30 seconds of this, his levels of anxiety broke him. He began to calmly direct me to turn around and leave, as if for my safety. I went along with him, silently, thinking that I should probably question him later. But for now, I wanted to get up top and leave. I should have been thinking more about just exactly what had frightened us. When we got back to the visitor center, and after not speaking a word, I had a few choice questions for Kay. He simply explained to me he started hearing a noise and eventually saw it. By glancing behind me, he spied some large being between the boulders. He tried to get a better view, but due to the rocks, a full view was obstructed. He wasn't really sure what it was, but that it scared him by the sight of it. I asked him, "Did you think it was a bear?" But he explained no, it did not look like a bear. It looked like a very large man, covered in hair, having large eyes and what he described as large teeth sticking out of its mouth. I kind of chuckled at him. "You mean like a monster?" He just gave me the most serious look I've ever seen Kay give me ever. Kay is a very stern and serious man. For him to be this upset, even in expression, says a lot. We locked gazes in that very moment. He just explained to me that this was not a man, this was not a bear. This was some unidentifiable animal. Who knows what could have happened? He got a very bad feeling about it. Well, about a month later, come August 15th, just after Kay and I's encounter, another one of our fellow rangers, who we'll refer to as Paul, and the chief ranger, who we will refer to as Larry, they went to the site of the reported event, the same place, and they too had their own sighting. Of course, they proceeded with the utmost caution, because they were alerted of a large bear in the area and went to go check it out. Right around that same area, near the boulders, both men claimed they were attacked by a large, hairy hominid type of thing. That it started with being pelted by rocks, then turned to large sticks and screaming. Both men, incredibly frightened, fled the scene. Kay was the one who later told me about this, as outside of the job, he was much more close to Paul and Larry. Ever since that August incident, and what him and I experienced that summer in July, I've heard from other people that Lake Meredith is a hotbed for strange paranormal sightings and happenings. Not that I'm really a fan or believer in the paranormal, but Kay obviously saw something, and Larry and Paul clearly encountered something that wasn't normal. I even know that many of the Native Americans in this area have a large amount of stories, seeing strange shapes among the red cedar, and hearing strange noises like unintelligible voices, grunts, and screams. Story 6. The Strange Ape Creature. We were training in a forested area here at a state park in Indiana. We had begun hearing strange vocalizations in this area, and both had been separately discovering large, human-like footprints. A good friend of mine has claimed to have witnessed an upright, dark, hairy creature retreating up the bank after being startled by his 16-year-old son while fishing. Large humanoid bipedal footprints had been discovered out behind a small creek where the bank became too steep for regular people like you and I to scale. So, at nighttime, we had done a watercraft training exercise in the area with our headlights handy. We started off in the northeastern section of the park, a more heavily wooded landscape behind the industrial section. The moon was just rising to our left at our location. After a few moments, we moved south, approximately 100 yards to a sand bay, and cut the motors. It was a calm night, containing about 60-degree weather and about 0.2 inches of precipitation in the last 24 hours. There was a little bit of snow covering the ground, but what was left was mushy. Considering of how fast this winter heated up over here in Indiana, The next half hour, we would find a series of large footprints all along the shoreline. At first, we thought of several things, trying to rationalize and expend every thought we could before coming to the conclusion this was not just a hiker or some large bear. That's right when my partner and I, we began to hear hoarse cries and what we would describe as whines, fast and connected, like a high-pitched talking. My partner was really curious and wanted to investigate, so we motored close to the shoreline, consisting of several 20 to 50-foot cliffs. While silently running up the shoreline, I played my light beam along the cliff face when a bright light caught my attention to the bottom of the cliff, about 75 feet out. There was some noticeable movement in the trees and brush, and through my binoculars, I was pretty sure I saw some sort of apparition standing upright from 10 to 12 feet in height. We cut the motors again, noticing that the distance we viewed this towering figure was approximately 100 yards out. It began walking slowly towards us, and what we first thought was an apparition, or a dark figure, we saw what looked to be like a gorilla kind of creature, upright on 2 feet, with black hair on its face, all over its arms, massive hands. This creature appeared to be much larger than initially thought, tapered at the waist, much more slender. After walking out maybe 20 more yards, it dove or submerged itself fully in the water, completely disappearing. My partner and I were stunned by what we had seen, not really sure what to make of it. We spent a little bit more time exploring our surroundings, making sure we just weren't crazy, and seeing this strange sight. Just then, in that moment, off in the tree line, we began to see several large red eyes looking back at us through the darkness of the trees. We decided now was probably a good time to retreat from this area. We had no idea what we were dealing with, no idea if these figures or beings were in any way hostile. Judging by the events of this evening, I believe they consistently line up to everything that points to a Bigfoot encounter, as does my partner, who I will keep anonymous. Having worked in this field for several years now, this was one of the only times I've ever encountered something that isn't normal. Story 7. Strange Ape Creature. I have always been fascinated by the idea of Bigfoots and other cryptids. So, when I had caught wind of apparent sightings in our state, I was more than willing to help out with this search. I was assigned to a team of a number of other park rangers. We had been driving around all day in order to find clues, as many people had talked about seeing a strange, large, hairy creature in the park. Figuring it might be a bear, we had to make sure. We have heard of several sightings, but it always managed to elude us. This thing, assuming it was not a bear, seemed to have an uncanny ability to hide in plain sight, then just disappear when we would try and approach the area next. Most of us knew that what we were dealing with was not a bear. We were now getting frustrated with the whole ordeal, being told by our supervisors this was some mysterious disappearing bear, while everybody who kept calling it in told us this was some strange, upright, hairy man creature, and our time allotment to go on this goose chase was ever thinning. On one of the evenings, we were talking about our next plan of action and how we can go about strategizing what and where we should intercept this thing next, assuming, again, it was a quote-unquote bear. That's when a couple of us heard a strange noise in the distance. It was a high-pitched screeching noise, similar to that of noises a bird makes, but much deeper not in pitch, but in timbre. The quality of bass frequencies coming through. It even left a ring in my ears. We all heard it. Then, we all saw movement come rushing toward us. A large, winged creature is the only way I know how to describe what it is we saw, moving very fast, almost completely invisible due to its darkened color. We all saw it. They drew their weapons and began firing. It was not a bird. It was much larger than anything any of us have ever seen. It was kind of like a bat, except much larger than a man. We all watched in amazement as it not only flew by us, completely, seemingly uninjured or unaffected by the gunfire, and flew directly off in the distance. It was gone from sight in a matter of seconds. We were all shocked. We could not believe what we had just seen. We just stared at the spot where it had disappeared off in the sky for a brief moment. Then, we all quickly got back into our vehicles and drove off. We were pretty freaked out by the whole thing. Here we were, convinced Bigfoot was real, chasing after it, being told by everybody else this was a Bigfoot, and our boss convincing us it was a bear. Then, we're sitting around strategizing what we should do next. And then this thing. I'm still in awe over the whole thing. We drove back to the station and reported our findings. They took it as pretty suspicious. Like they didn't believe us at all. My boss really wanted nothing to do with it. He was not about to entertain any cryptid notion whatsoever. He demanded we all go home, get a good night of sleep, and return at work first thing in the morning. That same night, I had one of the most realistic dreams I've ever had. Have you ever had a nightmare where it felt like you were not only in it, but like you were living it? It was just an extension of your consciousness, an extension of your world when you're awake. That's exactly what my nightmare was like. I dreamt this creature, which I can now see more vividly in my dreams, began approaching me as if it were stalking, almost ready to grab me, as it had already grabbed a young deer, huddled down. Then it was coming after me. I tried to shake the image, but this thing kept coming after me, and almost relentlessly about to grab me with its large black talons. I remember waking up in a cold sweat, just trying to get the image out of my head. Come to find out, the next day, all of us had some sort of strange dream very reminiscent of the same encounter we had that night. Chalk it up to a coincidence, but how is it that 4 or 5 of us all almost have the exact same nightmare, and none of us really dream much or have nightmares at all? The only thing I could possibly pinpoint this whole sighting to is what people call a Mothman, which is the infamous cryptid, first reported back in Western Virginia in 1966. But looking at pictures of that, I don't even know if that's what we saw. It did appear to have large black wings, but not like that. Ultimately, I still don't know what it is we saw that day, and we still have not found Bigfoot. Story 8. Deer Mutilations. So, out of all my years of doing park ranger service, this is by far the most disturbing finding. I've discovered at least 20 deer mutilations in this large clearing 8 miles away from the nearest campsite. The first time I discovered it, I parked my car in a large field close by, and I walk about a mile or so through the denser vegetation in the direction that I will believe lead me to the spot. I see what appears to be the remains of several deer carcasses, all with their fur removed and the head cut completely off. All the meat completely left intact. These deer had been gutted, sexual organs removed, but the meat left intact. No traces of flies or any sort of decay. It was very bizarre. Also, There was no odor either. The smell of death should have been very prevalent. Nothing. The kills did appear to be fresh. Within 8 hours, I would say. I then walk another 100 yards in the same direction, now getting into a small amount of trees and foliage. I also noticed 2 more deer, dead, same condition. All doe. I continued to walk in this direction when I noticed 10 more deer, littered all throughout. From the last to the first, no more than 300 yards apart from each other. All killed the exact same. Completely skinned, head missing, organs and sexual organs completely removed, meat intact, no death smell, no flies, no blood. All the meat completely left. Not really sure what to make of this. I radio back and tell them my findings. I was told to get out of there. This is not the first time I've dealt with this. Several of my colleagues and I have both found similar sightings happen over the course of the years that I've been here. Not in this specific section of the park, but just throughout. I've been informed that this is the work of aliens or UFOs, since cattle mutilations are very similar that happen. I don't really know much when it comes to cattle mutilations. Although I've heard the term, I know nothing about what that looks like. I'm afraid this might be something similar, or it could be somebody. But I wonder who would be out here killing 10, 20, 30 deer, and why? That doesn't explain the strange phenomenon of the no smell, no flies even, in the hot sun, and why would the meat be left intact? None of it adds up. Story 9. The Apparition. I'm a park ranger, and first, some background. I was hired by the state park system as an interpretive park ranger. My job is to hike the trails, show the visitors the sights, and educate them properly. I've been doing this for roughly 2 years now, and I had just had about enough. I hate the job. My first season, I didn't know what to expect. The first 100 or so people that I talked to were pretty friendly and listened to what I had to say. But after the first couple of weeks, I noticed people slowly starting to get more rude. This is just when I stopped giving out advice altogether. So, one Saturday night in September, as I was working in the park, I remember it was a pretty cool night. The park was pretty empty, except for a few campers, stragglers left over from Labor Day. I was on my way up the mountain trail, walking by myself, as the other ranger was on the other side of the park. It was nearly dark. Suddenly, as I rounded a bend in a trail, I see a man standing there, in what appears to be wearing an old dark suit, and his head was tilted to one side. If you've ever seen anybody in your life who looked completely out of place, this was it. At first, I assumed maybe he was lost, but then he looked over at me, head again tilted to the side. I looked at him in a moment of surprise, and I just said, "Hi, do you need help?" He didn't answer. He stood there, staring at me blankly for a moment. Then, he turned to the side and casually walked away. Now, I was confused. I tried to walk up to him and ask if he was lost, but he disappeared completely. I have no idea where he went. He walked right around out of my sight and disappeared. Kind of creeped out, I was like, alright, I'm heading back down the trail. I finished on my shift and went to go to find out more about this strange guy. Well, a couple of nights go by, and I hike up a different trail for about another hour. This was about 2 or 3 days later, a separate trail entirely, and I hear some shouting. Maybe it was a bunch of drunk, rowdy teenagers. I don't know. But as I got closer, The sound was that of a man yelling. That's what I had seen. It was the same man as I had seen earlier. So I ran to him, asking if he needed help. But he wasn't yelling in help. He was chanting something. It sounded like Latin, and holding a long, curved dagger. And that is when he fully disappeared, right in front of my eyes. Just vanished, faded out into nothing. I knew at that point, okay, I gotta stop working evening shifts. Something is going on here. Well, as it turns out, I later on talked to one of my other fellow park rangers. They too had been seeing this strange man in an old suit, dated somewhere back to, by the looks of it, the 1800s or early 1900s. I mean, we're talking old here. Their claim is that they too have seen him appear and reappear multiple times. To be honest with you, I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't believe in ghosts, but this whole apparition thing is very strange, to say the least. Story 10. The Old Man. I worked as a search and rescue officer and ranger back in the early 1990s. On this particular day, I was assigned to a search and rescue mission for an older gentleman who had gone missing on a nearby mountain. The old man was a known hiker and mountain climber. He had been hiking on that mountain for well over 20 years. He knew it very well and was very familiar with the mountain and surrounding terrain. I was told that friends and family were told that he went on a hike, but never returned. The search party already present found his truck and his hiking equipment. They figured he had went up further into the mountain. Everything seemed pretty run-of-the-mill about his disappearance, until I found him. I was in the chopper searching for him on the mountainside. When I was down on foot, I found something. You know, it was hard to tell what it was, but I had an idea. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be old rotted bones. That's when I made the discovery. There was indeed a body, half sticking up out of this wet dirt and soil. After radioing the search party down below, I told them what I had found. They told me that there's no way that could have been the missing hiker. What I was looking at was a badly decomposed human corpse. No human flesh, just old rotted bone. But this was unmistakably a human skeleton, or at least part of it. The chopper came in, helped me lift what little remains were out. Since he had just gone missing, it would be virtually impossible for him to have died and decayed that quickly. We continued our search because we wrote that skeleton off as it ever being him. We continued our search for another 6, 7, 8 days. No trace of him was ever found. Even the dogs lost his scent up a large incline in the mountain. This is when the information came back from the findings of those bones. Turns out, after matching his DNA with that of the skeleton, that was indeed him, or what was left of him. The DNA did not lie. It wasn't just that his DNA was on a skeleton. It was him, without a doubt. The bone structure of the skull even aligned with him, which means that somehow, within a couple of days, he had gone from fully alive to dead and completely decayed halfway in the ground, several miles up the mountain. How does that even happen? This has been by far one of the most puzzling cases we had ever seen or worked on. One of the most puzzling and harrowing search and rescue cases I'd ever been a part of. I'm glad I got out of that game while I could. Story 11. The Cult. I'm no longer a park ranger for the Forest Service industry, but I've seen and experienced some things that would make your skin crawl. I've seen the same thing for years. My friends and I, when we were working there, had been investigating it for a while, all leading up to this. It first began with some dead animals, like deer and elk, being found dead. We reported it, but it didn't really go anywhere. That's how it began. The corpses of these animals began to litter all throughout the park, to an overwhelming degree. We actually had tourists complaining about them, finding them in more open, obvious places. These weren't being mutilated, ripped open, killed in bizarre ways. They were just being found as if they had dropped dead. No traces of any obvious way they were dead. Later, we began seeing dead animals everywhere. Things like dogs and squirrels even. Dogs who belonged to campers and tourists. Like they were purposefully left there, like a sign to ward people off. Then, we began finding large pentagrams and strange markings on trees, along with other foreign objects. These things all took place on the far northern end of the park, where there is also the least amount of campsites. The only main entrance to the park is through the east. This means that whoever was connecting these rituals had to have been actually coming into the park. One evening, we received a call from an older man in his camper, closer to the northern end. He had been hearing weird and disturbing chanting coming from deeper in the woods on that end of the park over the course of the night. Like some sort of cult was meeting back there. That was the speculation for the longest time, until we were finally given the green light to investigate. We found nothing real at first, just a bunch of pentagrams and some other satanic activity that we found taking place. We were able to come back, and that's when we saw what appeared to be human feet and hands, severed, tied up together. Then there was the overwhelming odor of burnt flesh and sulfur. That's when the police became thoroughly involved, and we discovered severe levels of violence and murder. Upon a much more deeper investigation, there was actually bodies recovered, the result of a mass satanic ritual. Discovered were several human corpses, found to be tied up and burned alive. The entirety of the park was shut down for a short time. The cult, or anybody associated with the cult, or the rituals, or the animal killings, any of it, was never discovered. Upon reopening the park, the activity completely ceased. I can only assume they continued their operations, but in a different park, or forest, away from where we were. Story 12. Search and Rescue Horror. Having been pretty well versed in the search and rescue operations for quite some time now, you run into quite a few sticky situations, as they would call them. I have so many stories I could share with you, so I'll do my best to unpack a handful for you, as I'm sure you'll find them at least somewhat entertaining, but also, like your channel covers, terrifying at the same time. One such story that immediately comes to my mind is a little 5-year-old girl, years back, named Darcy, who was captured or abducted by what she described as a large bear. From her own account, the bear had snatched her when her mom was not looking, was jumping through other trees, and even fed her berries, and explained to her that she needed to eat to not be hungry. She had gone missing on a beautiful clear Saturday morning when the park was full, brimming with people. The next thing you know, the mom turns her head for just 1 second. The girl was gone, mysteriously disappeared. That little girl was gone for 17 days straight, without anything. The only thing she had was the minimal amount of clothes she had on, since it was summer. She was found 4 miles away from the spot in which she had gone missing, completely unharmed, playing casually, right in the middle of the woods, as if nothing was ever wrong. She was stumbled upon by an elderly couple who were hiking, had found her, and had turned her in. She was tearfully reunited with her loving mother, and upon being asked what happened, where did she go, she simply explained, "The large bear took me, fed me, take care of me." She looked very clean, had been well fed, hadn't missed a meal, and even her clothes, the same clothes she had been in for the last 17 days, upon the day she left, were completely spotless. No stains, no dirt. It's as if they had been washed and dried. Completely astonishing. Even more so considering she had been caught playing out in the woods, all by herself. She would explain to authorities and her mother that the big bear told her to stay put and that he would be right back. And that's when the older couple found her. She was then asked to describe what the big bear looked like, and being 5 years old, she calmly and collectively said, "Oh, he's kind of big and hairy, and he has big arms, and he has a very funny looking face, and talks weird, and really big teeth." They asked her, "Did the big bear hurt you?" She said no. "The big bear fed me berries and gave me water to drink." When asked where she had been sleeping, she told them and her mother that the bear had taken her down underground to a cave to sleep at night, where she was safe. Either way, this little girl seemed completely unfazed that she had been captured and taken by this big bear for the last 3 weeks. That's still one of the biggest mysteries. And when you look at stories from David Paulides, for example, his Missing 111, there are so many stories that line up with the same story that I dealt with on this day. This is not an isolated incident. In fact, many of the stories you would read in his book are nearly identical to the same stuff our search and rescue teams would deal with. Because being in search and rescue, you deal with a lot more missing hikers and missing persons than you would like to. It's just a part of the job. Like the fact that little girl was 4 miles away from where she was originally abducted. 4 miles. How does a 5-year-old walk 4 miles all by herself without getting dirty? And the terrain in which she was found, to the spot in which she was abducted, isn't flat at all. Due to the time of year, it's pretty rugged, with a lot of overgrowth and briar. There's no way she could have calmly made it over there by herself. I don't buy it. While I can't confidently say it wasn't human that took her, I know for a fact she was abducted by someone or something. What that was, I'm not sure. Of course, not all of our search and rescue missions go good. There have been other times and cases where we've recovered entire bodies, or pieces of bodies. One incident, we had a 35-year-old male go missing. Could not find a trace of him for 9 days, until about 15 miles away, in a completely isolated section of woods that dipped down into a large valley. We found his torso, completely naked, no blood, no arms, no head, no genitalia. Gone. Just his torso. We did not find any trace of his clothing, any of his equipment, nothing. No trace of any of those things around his corpse. And then you get some more disturbing stories. One time, we had a young lady, no older than 24 or 25, go missing. Luckily, we found her the same day she had gone missing. She was huddled up and terrified in a small section on top of a very large hill. When found, we'd asked her why she had refused to come down the hill and why she had even been reported missing in the first place. She seemed completely terrified, eyes bugging out of her skull, completely ghost white. She said, in her defense, she refused to leave the hill because she was terrified of what she saw at the base. Circling around the entrance of the hill and by the trees, she said, was a large man figure covered in hair with red eyes watching her from the tree line. She said when she made it up there, It was impossible for her to turn around without that thing watching her in the woods. It had been there all day and was still there now. But when SAR officers went to go check it out, they found nothing. However, there were many large branches, all the way to 10 feet high, that were snapped and broken off, and this foul odor was reported lingering in the area, an odor that was reminiscent of death and rotting meat. She was rescued, but not further questioned. We had yet another young man who had just turned 18 going hiking with some of his friends when he had gotten separated from his hiking group. After picking up his scent, his body was discovered, torn in pieces. Something large ripped him to shreds. His backpack and all of his equipment was also gone. Upon further inspection of his body, it was written down as a bear attack. But I'm telling you, after personally seeing the mess myself, bears don't do that. Bears kill a very specific way. They eat a very specific way. This was not at all the way a bear would kill. Something tore this boy to ribbons. And to be honest with you, it didn't look like it did much eating. It looked like he was just torn apart and left there. There wasn't even very many identifiable parts of him left, other than a few articles of clothing and a piercing he had on a part of his face that was still intact. The entire time we were dealing with that, I got a strange feeling around where we were, like we were being watched. Of course, I still had to do my job, but that's just what goes along with it. Something attacked and killed this boy. What? I don't want to see it. All I can say was, after that whole mess was taken care of, I was happy to be long out of that area. Unfortunately, I was also tasked with informing his parents of his passing. That's never an easy job, as you can imagine. And as you probably know, many of us SRA officers are thoroughly informed not to speak to anybody about anything. We're told to keep a lot of this quiet. Even some of my fellow officers have been threatened with all sorts of things in order to keep hush-hush, especially by their superiors. There are so many cases that go deep into the wilderness, the things that people don't even know about. For example, people talk about the whole staircases in the middle of the woods. Yeah, that might be what people call creepypasta. But what people don't talk about is the staircases they find leading down. Staircases that belong to old, dilapidated buildings that are no longer there, or are barely there. Story 13. Strange Lights. Back in 2013, for around a 6-month period, I was the main guy to be patrolling the park. Sure, everybody else had their duties, but the evening time was my shift. I wasn't really doing anything special, just the pretty much mundane, doing my rotations, looking for anything out of the ordinary, which I hardly did find. But there were a handful of times here and there that I experienced some things I can't quite explain. As a matter of fact, one evening, as I'm driving by myself, I see this weird flash of light in the sky, kind of like lightning. Yeah, think about that. But this was not a lightning bolt. In fact, the sky was clear of any overcast or weather patterns. In fact, I could see stars. What came after that bright flash was this large black object, slowly rotating and moving in the sky in a very strange direction. It's like it was going vertical, but east to west at the same time. I couldn't tell if I was looking at a cube or a circle or what this was. And I'm watching this thing, and it's moving all over the sky. And then another bright white flashes. Boom, it's gone. No trace of it. I just remember thinking, what the? Did I just see that? Trying to process what indeed I just seen, which I'm very confident was indeed a UFO. That was the precursor to this whole experience, because shortly after that, I would be driving towards the end of my shift, having completely forgot about this whole strange shape that I saw in the sky. Next thing you know, I'm enveloped by this incredibly blinding bright white light. Then, I look down at my clock. I'm somehow an hour and a half behind. What? I somehow went back in time. Of course, I didn't get enveloped by the light, and all of a sudden looked down at my clock. I'm just telling you what happened as far as an event had occurred. I have no way to explain what that was about and how that came together. The light enveloped me as soon as it dissipated. My clock before this was about 9:02 because I was about ready to clock off. When I came out of the light and it fully dissipated, it was now about 7:40. It was still dark out, so I could only assume I had gone backwards in time. I know that might be a crazy assumption, but afterwards I immediately went back to the station and began talking to my colleague who was sitting there at the desk. I was freaking out, of course, telling him what had just happened, explaining to him it was just 9:02 and now it's 7:40. He gave me a very strange look and said, "It's still an hour and 20 minutes till 9 p.m. Have you been drinking? Are you okay? Do you need to lie down?" I explained to him I swear what happened, that I swear that I was taken back in time by that same shape in the sky. I was not ready to write off that coincidence just yet. It still goes down as the most bizarre, freakiest story I've ever encountered while in the Ranger service. Story 14. The Winged Demon. Hi, I'm writing in a story about an event that happened roughly 15 years ago, during the autumn back in 2001. That was the year I was doing my final exam as an environmental science student with the University of Exeter in England. For my final year, I was required to complete work experience, and I chose to complete mine as a wildlife ranger at the Forest of Holyhead, a wild, vast expanse of forest which spans for 7 miles in width and 12 in length. The whole experience was a dream come true, as I thoroughly enjoyed the job, loved spending time with the like-minded individuals who had a passion for nature. I had no idea where there were so many insects and creatures which I had been unaware even existed. The experience was scheduled to last only 6 months in total, but unfortunately was cut short at 4 months, as something terrible and spooky happened, something which has haunted me these 15 years and has now prompted me to put pen to paper. When I first started my work experience, my supervisor, whom we'll call Allison, a red-haired lady in her early 60s, very close to retirement, warned me, and I kid you not, of sinister forces in the forest. When I pushed for details, she got kind of shady and nervous, did not want to speak further. It was the strangest thing. Allison was usually very jolly and very happy, upbeat, but talking about these sinister details, it would make her on edge. She just kept explaining to me, "Be careful." I assumed she meant shady guys roaming the forest at night, maybe cruising, or perhaps drug dealers used it as a meeting point. My mind did not go beyond that level of sinister operation. When I mentioned the conversation to the rest of my fellow colleagues, they too looked uneasy. They reminded me of a young boy, who we'll call Kyle, who was aged 7. He had gone missing in 1996 on a picnic with his family, had never been seen since. His grandmother spoke of something black and on fire that claimed her grandson. Weeks after his disappearance, she herself was admitted to the hospital, where it was later found she was suffering from advanced dementia and died shortly afterwards. My colleagues informed me that Kyle's parents never stopped searching for him. They believed something terrible and supernatural had happened in that forest, something of which had taken him and driven his grandmother to the edge. I speculate that the story may have been some ring of truth, possibly exaggerated over time, possibly for suspense or thriller purposes. Everyone loved a good ghost story, especially one about a forest. The story sounded spooky, but as I looked out at the autumn colors in the forest, I could never believe something that evil could occur out there. It looked picturesque, a haven for any creature. I was also shocked, as a large part of our job was to promote the use of the forest for people. If the story was true, then we were essentially promoting a murder playground. How could we get families to come? I thought. I dismissed the story as bogus, even laughing a little at my colleagues. They just told me to keep my mind open, that the forest had a long history of disappearances. I figured they had smoked too much. I even asked the secretary. She said she had been working in the forest industry for 30 years, but was adamant it was surely haunted. A few of us student rangers shared a cabin together in training. One night, we told each other ghost stories. There were 3 other guys in the cabin as well, so it was very boisterous and lively. The odd time we would have girls over, if we all got drunk, we would go skinny dipping in a nearby lake. It was a lot of fun. I was only 22, having the time of my life. There was a lot of crude jokes and pranks going on in the cabin, especially after several beers had been consumed. This night, one of the other guys, we'll call him Brian, got really drunk, began acting crazy. He opened the door to our cabin, yelling out like crazy. That's when he started yelling about Kyle, asking him if he boned Granny. A few of the other guys laughed at him, but it made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know what to believe regarding this story about little Kyle's disappearance, but I knew it was beyond jokes. It was distasteful, as my mother always said, and karma has this funny way of getting to you. I explained to him, knock it off and come back inside. But he just kept yelling in a goofy voice. Just strange stuff. I couldn't believe he was acting this way. It was cringeworthy. Eventually, he came back inside, and we settled down for the night. When I awoke at 3 a.m., I looked over at Brian's bed just to check that he had not been sick. I squinted in the darkness. I couldn't make out his figure. I got up and went for a closer look at his bed. He was gone. His quilt perfectly made, which was the eeriest thing. His bed was always a mess, no matter what time of day it was. Why had he made his bed? I distinctly remember him getting into bed, snoring almost instantly. I panicked, checking the bathroom, the kitchen, our small living room. He was gone. I woke the others. We were all pretty spooked that he was nowhere to be found. He was in no fit state to go anywhere, and if he did, he would have likely fallen down or possibly drowned. We got dressed with our flashlights. Remember, this was 2001, so long before portable phones and really good flashlights. We decided to break up and start searching. I looked in our indoors bathroom, made sure he had not passed out in there. No sign of him. There were no signs of him around the cabin, but we did notice what looked to be fresh footprints leading into the darkened forest. It was like looking into a vast ocean of blackness, with the only sounds of hoots of owls or the trees swaying back and forth in a gentle wind. We began to get a little nervous, as although we loved the forest, it looked pretty creepy at night. I figured there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps Brian just went out for a walk and was going to stagger back to the cabin. But then I remember his actions. Just a few hours earlier, how taunting his voice had been, mocking the little boy who had disappeared. Icy fear welled in my stomach, and I wondered if any of the other guys had the same thoughts. I continued calling out, "Brian, can you hear me?" Nothing. My footsteps thread on the autumn leaves, crunching on the forest floor. This would have been a beautiful walk, had it not been for the fear of Brian's disappearance. I tried to illuminate as much as I could, carefully concentrated on every sound I could hear. I could hear him talking. "Help, help." His voice sounding anguished, sounding disembodied, but yet clear enough to make out. It sounded as if he was coming deeper in the forest. I gulped as I noticed how black and far in I was getting. I told him I'm coming. I called back. My heart was racing, not knowing what I was about to encounter. "Please help me. Help me." His voice was agonizing to hear in this state. I had never heard him in such pain or distress. He was clearly pleading, as if in his last moments. My heart felt like it was going to rip out of my chest. I began running, turning my head left to right, cautiously examining every little illuminated detail for any sign of Brian. I realized how utterly helpless I was. If he was able to be held by something sinister or dangerous, I had no defense mechanism. I was empty-handed, vulnerable, but still, I knew I had to save him. Although he had been a complete jerk, he did not deserve to die. I couldn't even bear to think what that would mean. The next sounds I heard were a large amount of frantic screaming. It sounded as if it was from a wild animal, but no one I knew it was from Brian. I began crying, starting to think it was in his last moments, asking, "Where are you?" I could hear him sobbing. I was now running, arms raised and ready to fight whatever man or beast was holding my friend captive. Then I stopped. Before me on the ground was Brian. He was kneeling and sobbing, dressed only in his boxers. His head was in the ground, and he was beating the forest floor with his fists. He had large red scrapes all down his back and a gash on his cheek. I walked up to him, being fully aware this could be a trick, and this might not be Brian. But he turned to see me, and I knew from his eyes, vulnerable and terrified, that this was indeed my friend. I held on to him, putting his head in mine, allowing him to sob. I watched closely all around me to see if whatever had caused this distress to Brian would reappear. It was getting light now. It must have been 4:30 a.m. I felt whatever it was now gone. The other guys eventually found us, and we all helped to carry Brian back to the cabin. We told our supervisors and senior ranger what had occurred, not mentioning Brian's taunts towards the little boy Kyle. Brian was bedridden for 2 weeks, then had to be brought into the hospital for a severely infected wound. He never came back. We got a phone call about 6 weeks later, saying that his mother would be arriving to take Brian's stuff back. We asked how he was. Not good. I still haven't seen him for years now. But actually, I bumped into his mother about 2 years prior. He's been in a mental ward for the last 14 years. Whatever happened to him that night changed him forever. All he talks about is something black, fiery wings, and a viper's tongue that nearly took his life. Some of the other guys don't believe it at all, but I feel as a ranger something happened to Brian in the forest. Something dark. Allison had warned me after all. I don't know if it was the kid that took Brian or something else, but he was traumatized. I lost my friend to whatever happened in that forest. All the guys left after Brian's mom took his stuff out. Many of us could not sleep at night, not knowing what was out there in the forest. I don't know what happened to Brian exactly, but it was something terrible, and every time I think about that night, I still get shivers going up my spine. Story 15. Death Becomes Her. Hello, what lurks beneath. I can't tell you my name, or where I actually work, but for the sake of what I have to relate to you, I will use the name Jim, and I will tell you that I do work for the forest service industry, where a stone is a particularly sunny color. Do you understand? I know that you usually deal in cryptid encounters, but I've come across some things that are just as out of this world and paranormal as you would ever understand. There's a few playgrounds scattered throughout the park. I mean, you'd expect that, having as many tourists as we do. Often, it's part of my job to patrol these in a regular circuit to make sure that things stay compliant, if you catch my drift. The way I usually carry this out, I park my car, I sit and watch for a few minutes, then I get out, take a stroll. If all's well, I go on to the next area. In the middle of one exceptionally boring day, I was doing my usual strolling during a very busy hour. Kids were out of school and parents were letting them run wild, probably hoping they would leave all that energy here. I watched as this little boy reminded me very much of my own son. A little girl with very white, rather pale skin and straight black hair ran over to him, asked if he wanted to come meet her grandparents. They were sitting over on a park bench with their backs to us. I kind of smiled at how easily children could make friends. Adults have a lot to learn. Towards the end of the day, there was the announcement of an Amber Alert. A very small boy had gone missing. A picture of the boy was officially released. It was the exact little boy I had seen with that little pale girl. There were gears turning in the back of my head all night, and I just could not put a finger on what it was that was bothering me. The next day, I was on patrol again, with orders to keep my eyes peeled for that same little boy that I had saw the day prior. I kept my eyes peeled for him all day. After all, he'd be hard to miss. He looked just like my son. I saw the same little girl from the day before, the pale skin and the dark hair. She came up to yet another little girl, asked her if she would like to meet her grandparents. That's when those gears in my head began working. There they were again, two older folks sitting with their back to all the kids sitting on a bench further up the trail. My eyes shifted over to the dark-haired girl and her new friend, who were agreeing to go meet the grandma and grandpa. That's when I made my move. "Excuse me, can I meet your grandparents too?" She wasn't happy to see me. She looked like I was ruining some fun of hers. She took the other girl's hand and led her up the trail, keeping me in sight with a sidelong look. I followed from a distance. The two girls stood in front of the couple. The dark-haired girl was definitely not happy to see me. The other girl looked confused, even a little frightened. "Okay," said the dark-haired girl, and rushed her new friend back to the playground. I strolled up to the older folks. They did not seem to notice me. I called that a greeting, as to not startle them. I thought they just might be hard of hearing, but they didn't stir a bit. When I came around to stand in front of them, I could see they were two withered up dead bodies, dry as dead leaves. Another Amber Alert went out that night, that time for the other little girl that the dark-haired one had led away from me. Story 16. The Ritual. I grew up in the mountain, west, and have had a strong love for the outdoors as long as I could remember, actually. Something about the practically limitless opportunities to explore and discover new things to stumble upon. Something that few people have ever seen before. Absolutely fascinated. You can never keep me inside as a kid. I would be out about trying to find new sights to see or trees to climb. The world was my jungle gym. I spent much of my youth in the Scouts, volunteering every summer I could at camp. Let's just say it did not shock anybody when I ended up as a park ranger after graduating college. My first job was in a park that was somewhat small and did not have many employees on top of its piss-poor management. I found myself taking on all sorts of jobs throughout my time there. My tasks had their ups and downs, but none of them ever compared to the experience I had while patrolling a section of the reserve's forestry. I understand this is going to sound a bit dramatic. Perhaps it is. But that week was a turning point in how I approached my life in general. Up until then, I had an upbeat, optimistic guy, always trying to see the best in others kind of look. A very strong love for people, animals, and the planet we were sighted on. I mean, I still do to a degree, but I definitely approached my sentiment a far more naive manner in the past. While I was patrolling in the forest that day, a smell of smoke breezed past my nostrils. Turning my head in that direction, continuously catching whiffs as I followed where it was coming from. There, I found a small fire pit made up of boulders, probably no more than 3 feet in diameter. The fire inside seemed as if it had been out for some time, so I knew the chances of me catching the person who built it were slim. That was a bit frustrating. Visitors were absolutely not allowed to start fires, except in designated areas during certain times of the year, for very good reason. In the past, I would catch teenagers with all sorts of things, but few items ever presented a legitimate danger to the park. So, of course, the one time I stumbled upon something that I did, I had no indication of who was responsible. Not knowing what else to do, I dismantled the fire pit in hopes to discourage its creator from making one again, should they ever pass through the area once more. The rest of the day was pretty boring, and if I was being honest, I always took the time to appreciate the nature around me. But that didn't mean it was particularly exciting. I returned to work the next day, already having forgotten about the fire pit situation from the previous night. I had already let the other staff and my superiors know about it, but, like me, they mostly just shrugged their shoulders and said to let them know had I found out anything else. And, as it turned out later on in the day, I did. It wasn't anything inherently dangerous. However, it did feel far more threatening than the fire pit. I wound up spotting a grimy old stuffed animal of a deer, a string wrapped around its neck as it was suspended from a tree branch. Something about that chilled me far more than if the figure were something like a human doll. I mean, I guess if that were the case, it would feel too obvious, like somebody was trying too hard to spook people. Why would somebody choose a toy deer out of all the things to suspend from a tree was beyond me. I checked out the area a bit more, made out yet another fire pit. I wasn't too far away from the area where I had found the one from the previous day, so I was certain I would have stumbled upon it already. I began to wonder if the perpetrator returned after I left the site and reconstructed their fire pit. I took a deep breath, rolling my eyes, talking into my walkie-talkie about the second pit I had found, and then went over to deconstruct it, just to be sure I was not going insane. I left the site and did not return until later in the evening. Nothing was there. Satisfied with my work, I went home for the day. I had the next day off, but requested my coworkers to keep me thoroughly in the loop about whether or not they'd seen any new fire pits emerging. I didn't get any news. I was patrolling a different area of the park that day, and of course, once more, stumbled upon a fire pit. However, this time, it did not have any wood actually in it. It was just a circle of rocks. I reported it nonetheless. And it wasn't long before I heard my boss over the walkie-talkie to telling me to quit being so paranoid. I sighed, simply kicking the structure apart. I despise this game of cat and mouse. When I went on my lunch break, I decided to head back to one of the buildings and get some snacks out of a vending machine. I would ask the other staff if the night patrol had noticed anything strange. That's when I learned that the night patrol did not actually do anything, mostly just dicked around. When I asked if they were the ones responsible for building the fire pits, they told me no. I also brought up stuff about the hung deer, which was just met with responses of laughs. Nobody really seemed to care or be bothered by what was going on. I was the odd one out. Even though I wasn't getting paid to stay past my shift, I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I decided to stick around where night came. Instead of just going home late, I would sleep in my car if need be. After all, young curious me was determined to figure out to catch the person who was building these fire pits. I didn't tell anybody I was staying. Out of fear, they'd give me a hard time or make me go home. I turned off my only walkie-talkie and stuck around the area where I had found the most recent fire pit. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of people talking and pacing around. It was not long before a flashlight came into view, and I could make out two men walking around in what appeared to be gray cloaks, holding bags that seemed to be stuffed to the brim. I was perplexed, as anyone would be. One of them grumbled about how that guy kept kicking down their fire pits, and I watched as they built it once more. I was so curious and fascinated. I had completely forgotten to even try to put a stop to their antics. I was armed, so I wasn't in any danger, but I had no idea what these guys could be carrying. One of them opened his bag. There were just a bunch of sticks, and the other lit a fire. Then, I watched them walk around as they seemed to light up more fire pits until the entire area made one big ring of flame. There were a few calls, and a third cloaked man came out with a ladder. The second bag was opened. From what I could indicate, there was just a bunch of stuffed animals inside. I watched as they stringed up the animals onto the trees, before going to the center of the ring and lighting up what appeared to be a candle. One of them made a comment about how it needed to be quick, to which the other argued that their process cannot be rushed. I had no clue what was going on. Looking back, I still don't understand what their goal was. They all faced each other. Then, two more men came out and joined them. They all sat cross-legged and let out these low, melodic hums. By now, I came to the assumption this had to have been some sort of cult ritual. I was split on whether or not to intervene. I had no idea whether this was a nightly thing or seemed only planned and if that was the case, I knew I would rather leave them alone, let them finish up and leave, so they wouldn't be a problem anymore. Another part of me knew it was also my responsibility to keep this park safe. Even past my shift, I was still on site. I admit, I didn't know what inherent danger these men possessed, besides the fire, which was still not allowed. It did seem to be well controlled, though. For the most part, these guys just really creeped me out. I could have approached them, but at the same time, like I said, I have no idea what kinds of weaponry they could have had concealed under their cloaks. I decided to just head back, before turning my walkie-talkie back on and informing the rest of the staff what I had just uncovered. They were mostly just confused about both what I was describing and why I was still around past my shift. I explained that I stayed in order to see what was going on, and at this point was fed up with nobody doing their job. So I let them have it, cussed them out quite a bit. They told me they would come up and help, but 20 minutes passes with no sign of anybody. That's when I decided to go back and confront my coworkers face to face. They were, of course, drunk and did not particularly believe me. I had to drag them out to my car and haul them to the place. However, by the time my headlights shone in that area, it was completely dark. We get out of the car. I take out my flashlight, and the stuffed animals were still hanging in the tree, and the fire pits were no longer burning, but emitted smoke. The sight seemed to make my coworkers sober up pretty quickly. We investigated the area a bit more. When we couldn't find these men, we sent out some people to look for them. We had come across several corpses of animals, like deer, coyotes, raccoons, all with ropes tied around their neck. We cut it off before leaving the animals to rest, and quickly dismantle the site of the ritual. There wasn't much else to do. There wasn't much else we could do. The search ultimately turned up nothing, and the fire pits stopped being built. No more stuffed animals. Like I said, this whole event shifted my mindset. While I still love the outdoors and exploring it, and discovering things it offered, it was also a great venue to conceal darker parts of the world. I suppose I just tread the world a little more carefully now. I've become a bit pessimistic in regards to my career. It has been a long time since I have worked at that park, and granted, I've stumbled across plenty of those close calls in the wild since. Confrontations with grizzlies, for example. Still, none of them ever shook me like that event. And to this day, I still feel a bit creeped out when I come across a pile of rocks. Story 17. Voices. I've been a park ranger now for well over 30 years. At some point, they decided that they would take some of the workload off my feet. Let me do most of my work at the visitor center, which is just about a third of the way into the natural reserve. My body appreciates their consideration for the condition that I'm in, but my mental health does not. Keeping on the move and always on patrol was my way of coping with things. Working out at the visitor center gave me more time to think. That's not necessarily a healthy thing for me. Suffice to say that I'm divorced, and my kids do not want to talk to me, all while I'm facing my twilight years by myself. I'm not trying to draw attention to myself. Those will be necessary details in just a few seconds. They forced me to take coffee breaks if I had to go too hard for too long. So, I was taking one such coffee break on the outdoor wooden park benches, completely by myself. People don't come to the park to look around. Besides, the brochures of park information, the only thing the place has to offer is the same 4 or 5 fun facts about the forest posters that have been hanging up here for the last 25 years. We've all seen them. Nobody wants to see them again. I was yanked out of my thoughts when I heard a voice that I had not heard for over 15 years. I recognized it right away. It was the voice of my ex-wife, and she was calling my name. Just as my brain was trying to come up with a rational explanation as to why I was hearing her voice, I heard my daughter's voice come out to me also, except she didn't sound like the 43-year-old woman she had grown into. Instead, it was her 8 or 9-year-old voice. I was anchored to the park bench for a while, afraid to move just in case I was having a heart attack, a stroke, or experiencing something else that would mess with my mind. Maybe a near-life or near-death experience. Perhaps it was a practical joke. But who could mimic those voices so well and know my name at the same time? I decided to try a more tactical approach. I would come towards the voices, but I wouldn't answer them. There were long pauses between each call, as if my wife and daughter were waiting for an answer. But then they would call out again, and it was in those moments that I would pick up on the direction that they were coming from. Unless my ears were lying to me, it sounded like they were coming from the woods that came right up against the physical building of the visitor center. I stepped through the trees as silently as possible, resting when there was silence and walking when I heard voices. I came to an opening in the trees that couldn't have been more than 14 feet in diameter. It was clustered by some low-growing shrubs. I stayed hidden as best as possible. It sounded like the voices were coming from a small clearing. I didn't see how that could be possible. If my wife and my daughter were there, they'd be visible, unless they were lying down in the wild shrubs. I stared for what felt like forever, but then a shape slowly rose out of the growth, and the first thing I notice are these 2 large black eyes. They were proportionate to its head, the same way the eyes of a fly are proportionate to its head. Everything about it was just a little too long. The neck, the shoulders, the arms. It didn't stand up to its full length, just high enough to get a good look around, before it opened its mouth and spoke with both the voice of my wife and voice of my daughter, calling out to me, asking where I was and what was taking me so long. Then it sank back down into the brush. I could see its pale ribbed back bent over underneath the topmost leaves of the shrubbery. That's where it did its best to stay hidden. I pulled out my service pistol, and I shot as many times as I could before this thing realized there was a problem with its plan. At least 2 good hits bloomed black on its pale flesh before I sprang up and ran. I don't know if the other 3 or 4 shots hit or not. Miraculously, I was able to slip back to the visitor center and not have to offer an explanation to anybody. The older gal that works behind the front desk asked if she had heard something. I just told her I saw some kids setting off fireworks. My ex-wife may be many things, but somebody with the ability, let alone the intelligence, to send some strange, forest monster after me and lure me out with the sound of her voice isn't one of them. After this incident, I've kind of given into the urging of my superiors to spend more time in the visitor center, less time tromping around. There are clearly forces at work in this world that know more about me than I know about them, and the less I have to tangle with them, the better. Story 18. Disturbing. I don't know if anybody's going to believe me, but there's only one way to find out. When you see the small town that I live in, you wonder why they even bother setting aside funds for a patrol of the parks. You know, I guess you just never know when the trouble is going to come find the outside world in this little quiet place. Something that happened very recently has made me question whether trouble always comes from the outside. Our parks are small, but they are just big enough to have a couple of walking trails. If a day is feeling especially slow, I'll take the time to walk these trails, just for the hell of it. On paper, that means that I'm absolutely sure that there is no trouble whatsoever. So, one day, I'm walking the trail, and I get a real strong whiff of something good and dead. Not unlike the smell that might come from under your front porch when a squirrel or something else crawled away to die. But this was a strong, putrid odor. Something enough to make me question the size of the carcass. Once I could tell which direction the wind was coming from, I began to follow the smell. It led me off trail and into a thick of trees. The more crowded the trees got, the worse the smell became. This brought me into a very small clearing that I didn't even know existed. Here, I discovered scraps of sheet metal cobbled together into something like a shrine, complete with a peaked, corrugated roof. Small scraps were arranged into an altar. Behind it was a corpse that was set upright by a virtue of railroad spikes, driven through the chest and shoulders, pinning it to a large wooden crate. The legs were posed cross-legged. The head had been removed and replaced with a skull of buck with large antlers. Pink even still stained the skull, telling me that both the head and the corpse were about as fresh. Loud flies even filled the air. I don't know what to phone any of this in, as if it couldn't get any stranger. I saw something under the skull, lodged in the neck. There were papers, rolled up and weighed down by the skull. I phoned the whole thing in, waiting for dispatch, but nobody ever came in. I raised a holler over it, but everybody I mentioned it to just looked at me, like they didn't know what I was talking about, or they just didn't care. I called the paper to tell them about what I had found, but as soon as I told them which park, they hung up on me. Nobody around here is listening, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't think I can do anything about it. Story 19. The Note. The park that I service gets virtually little to no traffic. Part of that is because of how small the town is. Another part of that is today's Americans just don't get out for fresh air anymore. It's kind of sad, really. I see the video games people play today, a lot of them involving getting out into the wild, enjoying the fresh air and hunting and surviving. And people are literally paying money for a simulation of things they could do if they just go and get out of the house. And yet, even as little traffic as our park gets, I still find just enough litter to make me irritated. As if people get out into nature just long enough to ruin it for everyone else. I was cleaning up some fast food wrappers off of a park bench when, among the trees, I noticed something a little different. There was one of those corn husk dolls. The old kind. They are fashioned after the type that Native Americans used to make. It didn't have a face, just a blank knob for a head, and 4 nubs for arms and legs. Kind of cute in a creepy way. I thought to myself, until I noticed a small piece of paper rolled up and tucked into one of its folds. I unrolled it, and it just said, "Hello there." I smirked myself, decided that I had found some garbage that was worth keeping. After I was done picking up all the trash around the area, I went back to my patrol car, where there was another corn doll stuck behind the handle of the door. It too had another message. It read, "I said hello." My skin prickled and I looked around. As far as I could tell, I was the only person in the park. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but then again, I was very absorbed in my work when I was picking up the garbage. Perhaps someone was watching me, so they could have snuck in and put this on the door without me noticing. Still, I didn't like to think that somebody got me like that. I got inside my car, shut the door, and no sooner had I done that, I noticed yet a third doll sitting on the steering wheel. Yes, it had another note. It said, "Could you use a hand?" I nearly soiled myself when something smacked into the windshield. It took a second to register that it was indeed a severed arm and a hand cut off at the elbow. Blood splattering on the glass, slowly running down in streaks. Worse yet, it was a smaller hand. I immediately radioed out that we had a psychopath on the loose. The response came fairly quickly, but I wasn't sure if it was soon enough to keep up with whoever was inside the park. I didn't have much time, so I brought everybody up to speed, and there was a thorough sweeping of the park. They didn't find anything. No killer, no body, no evidence. Forensics did tests on the severed arm, found out that it did indeed belong to a child that had been missing for over 2 months. The arm that hit my windshield was relatively fresh, so that meant the kid was still alive when this happened. The rest of the day kind of just went by in a haze. I felt like a failure for not catching that monster, and all the moments that I could have when he was tampering with my car. My day ended on an ominous tone when I came home and there was one of those same corn dolls stuck behind the doorknob of my home. And guess what? It had a note. Let's play again soon. If you or someone you know has a story they would like me to read or share with me, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. I would love to read it.